hacking, additional considerations. What we're going to do in this chapter is talk about some different considerations you need to make when you're doing red team hacking. Our objectives are to review challenges to red team hacking. Unfortunately, security continues to improve. So some of these challenges, networks are not flat. You're going to run into filters. You're going to run into defense. You're going to run into a lot of different things that security has come up with to try to make it more difficult to break in. Defenses abound. They're pretty much everywhere we look today, somebody will have a product or some form of defense deployed to try to stop us from getting in. The good news is we know they have to allow services and protocols, so there's always a chance we'll find a vulnerability in something to get in. But some of these challenges are IPS, intrusion prevention systems, load balancers. How do you know which balancer you're on? And then web application firewalls. These are just some of the defenses that we might run into. So we're going to discuss some of the characteristics of these defenses. IPSs have a threshold. You stay beneath it and you'll remain undetected or undeterred. Now, was doing a test for one of the clients, a very large client, and had a lot of defenses in place, a lot of IPS, all that type of stuff. And finally, every tool we ran showed us nothing. I mean, the entire team could find nothing on it. Finally, one night, I started tweaking down my scans, and I started scanning just a few ports at a time. And I started getting information. So then I started to tweak my scans up a little bit, and up a little bit more. And I finally realized the threshold of the scans was 300 ports. If we scanned less than 300 ports, we got information. Well, needless to say, when we went into the client for the outbrief presentation, and I was given the presentation, and I brought up a listing of all this stuff I had found, they were shocked. They had spent a lot of money deploying IPS, intrusion prevention systems, but these systems all have thresholds. What we do is we lab it up. You build that range. Once you get it labbed up, you figure out what threshold it's at, you stay beneath it, game over, we win. Load balancers. We can face a challenge with the shifting. If it shifts back and forth, we might see one setting here and one setting there. So these can present a problem. Possibly the backup or the secondary unit that they shift to in the load balancing, depending if it's load balancing the web, if it's load balancing some other type of protocol. Lots of times the load balancing, if you get it to shift or you know where it shifts at and you can force it, the shifting unit that it shifts to will not be in the same configuration state as what you initially test. So the good news about that is a lot of administrators are busy. They just don't have the time. So they don't always patch all the different systems across the load balance range. So as long as we get one of the systems within the load balance range that we can get access into, we win. And now these. We talked a lot about different types of attacks against web applications, stuff like that. So we have these purposely built firewalls to block those types of attacks. That is, web application firewalls. They're a challenge. We can do obfuscation and penetrate it because they're a challenge, but they're not perfect. They are a monitoring device that has a programmer that programmed them. So they can have vulnerabilities themselves. So part of our lab environment, once we identify, and we'll look at that in a little bit, once we identify what the actual web application firewall is, then we can actually attempt to bypass it or attack it itself. Put it in the lab environment and see what works against it and doesn't work against it. Most of the time, these devices ignore certain directories. They ignore the Exchange server, for instance. They don't want to make and mess up somebody's information store. They can ignore DNS traffic. They ignore different things that on a system might get them in trouble. Some of the tools. For intrusion prevention system detection, we have a tool called AFD. For load balancer detection, we have a tool called LBD. And finally, for web application firewall detection, we have WAF-WOOF, or we can manually detect the web application firewall, depending on the error message. The administrator has to change the error message, or there's certain things that'll come up and say, do not go here, it's protected by WebNight, or some other web application firewall name. These are the things we can use to our advantage, but make no mistake, security continues to improve and make our job more of a challenge. Now, we're going to do a demo on some of these challenges.